Strength and conditioning professionals are often confronted with the task of disabusing our clients and athletes of what we consider to be the bogus advice of physicians and physical therapists and personal trainers, and that great source of misinformation, the internet. And one of the most pernicious pieces of advice is that our clients, especially those who are weak and deconditioned, should, if they lift weights at all, lift low weights for high reps. But is this really bogus advice? Not according to the results of a recent paper that have been highlighted in the mainstream media, the paper by Stuart Phillips Group at McMaster, which has been widely hailed as scientific proof that lifting low weight for high repetitions will make you just as strong as lifting heavy weight for low repetitions. If this result is true, it undercuts decades of coaching practice and would mandate a change in the way we train athletes and the general public. But is that the actual result that was found in this paper, and is it in fact true? What we have here is a paper that has been spun to say that you can lift low weights for lots of repetitions and get just as strong as lifting high weights for low repetitions. But the problem is that the paper did not actually examine what happens when we lift high weights for low repetitions, and therefore any such conclusion is invalid. The title of the paper is "Neither Load nor Systemic Hormones Determine Resistance Training-Mediated Hypertrophy or Strength Gains in Resistance-Trained Young Men."
One of the things that they highlight that makes this study different than a lot of the previous work in this area is that they use resistance-trained population. So they have 49 subjects in this study, all of whom have a minimum of 2 years resistance training experience, at least according to the authors. This subject population is not as highly trained as the authors would like us to think that they are. By telling us that they have an average of 4 years training experience, they're trying to differentiate this study from a lot of the previous research that's been done. But then when you look at their actual numbers and you see what their 1RM bench press is, when you compare their 1RM leg extension strength to the previous work that's been done on untrained populations, and you see that they're very similar, you're right back at the same problem that you have with the other studies. No repetitions were performed lower than 8 reps throughout the duration of the 12-week training period. And essentially what they're telling us is that after 12 weeks of these resistance-trained men going through these 2 separate protocols, there was essentially no differences found in terms of improvements in 1RM strength, muscle hypertrophy, impact of hormonal profile, and things like that, on the subject population. The percentages that they're using and the repetition scheme that they're using, obviously, to us as strength and conditioning professionals, doesn't equate to what we would consider to be high loading, low repetition type work. And the fact that they're using 75 to 90% of 1RM, but a minimum of 8 repetitions in a highly trained subject population, people who are highly trained are not going to be able to perform anywhere near 8 repetitions with 90% of their 1RM.
So even before we've gotten out of the abstract, we've encountered some significant difficulties, not the least of which is the implausibility of one of the training protocols that we're talking about here.
First of all, obviously it's a 12-week protocol, and they test 1RM every 3 weeks, so it's tested 5 times. Now this may or may not end up becoming a problem later on. It's a comparison study, so there's no actual control to test for the repeat bout effect. There's no control between the 2 groups. All they're doing is comparing the results between two treatments. We talked about the repeat bout effect, the fact that as you do the test, it gets better and better and better. And they completed the test 5 separate times throughout the training protocol. So now we look at table 1. It should tell us something about these resistance-trained subjects. What they say is 4 years resistance training, and they define that by self-identification. These bros said, I've done 4 years resistance training. They train at least twice a week and at least 1 dedicated leg training session a week. First off, their bench press. So bench press in both groups, 98 and 97 kilograms. You're looking at about a 215-pound bench at a body weight of 190. for 4 years of strength training. They're doing a study based on a study that they did before. They used the same exercise, the leg extension. They call it the knee extension in this one. But these are resistance-trained subjects, and their 1RM to start on the knee extension is 76 kilograms. In the last study, those resistance training naive subjects averaged about 73 kilograms on the unilateral knee extension. So the question is, that's the only exercise that compares between the two studies. What's the difference between resistance training naive and resistance trained if on the one compared exercise, knee extension, they're at the same strength level? When you go to the actual strength gains and you look at their final numbers, their shoulder press actually exceeds their 1RM barbell bench press. So there are certain elements of the study, how it's conducted, that we can't know because obviously we aren't there, watching how they do it. But without some exemplar, some representation of how they conducted it, we look at that data and we're like,
There's a whiff of implausibility there.
absolutely. Implausibility and a question of what is the value of using that particular exercise if clearly with so little muscle mass compared to the bench press and ability to lift weight, you can outpress yourself.
If you look at the actual increase in bench press strength for both groups, so the higher weight, lower repetition group, on average, at a body weight of around 190 pounds, put 14 kilos on their bench in 3 months. That's about 30 pounds. So this is supposedly a resistance-trained population, which we know is not. They're closer to novices. They're probably much closer to novices than they are to advanced lifters. And on average, they put about 10 pounds per month on their bench press. In the high rep, lower weight group, they put about 9 kilos, almost 20 pounds on their bench in the same 3 months. So that's what the difference actually came out to be. So when you think about it, you could also swing it as both groups got equally poor results from these programs for the most part, but a statistically less poor result in the barbell bench press compared to the high rep group. So as we mentioned, the high rep group performed 3 sets of 20 to 25 repetitions per set, with the load ranging between 30 and 50% 1RM, and each set was performed to volitional failure. And think about what volitional failure means, right? Volition is like your willingness to go on, right? So after you get to the point where you just can't go on, you take, you end up taking 1 minute of rest, and then you do it again. And then you go to failure, and then you take another minute rest, and then you do it again. So that was the high rep group. The low rep group, in comparison, performed all their exercises similarly for 3 sets, 8 to 12 reps per set, with the load supposedly between 75 and 90% on the 1RM that had been measured previously. It's not plausible for a male to perform 12 reps with 90% of 1RM. It's
For 3 sets.
much
1
less
minute
for 3
rest
sets.
in between.
What they did was they had the personal trainers who are managing them basically titrate the load between sets. They said, well, you are either failed to get your prescribed number of reps or you're really not going to get your next set. So let's drop 5 or 10% of the weight. So that presents a bit of a problem. And then similarly, in subsequent sessions, say your first set, you are feeling really good that day and you're able to bang out 15 reps, but you're in the 8 to 12 rep group, well, up goes your weight. So it's kind of an arbitrary, they said 5 to 10% typical jumps, right? But they basically had the trainers titrate the load to keep the lifters in the prescribed rep range. We don't actually know what this did to the percentage of their 1RM. We're just kind of trusting them that stayed within that supposed 75 to 90% or 30 to 50%.
Yeah, that's an
1RM
important
range.
point that the authors give, and to be fair, it would be a voluminous amount of data, but the authors give us no data on what actually happened during training. They simply tell us that they made these adjustments on the fly, and so we don't know, for example, in the 75 to 90% 8 to 12 rep group, how much of that work was done at 90% and how much of that work was done at 75%, because the authors don't tell us.
The rep ranges they picked obviously are comparing not high reps to low reps, but high reps to even higher reps. That's a better way of describing it. And so the authors kind of position themselves in a way that they're trying to refute classical strength training dogma. I think they use the word dogma a few times in the paper. I would recommend that if you're trying to refute dogma, you actually study the dogma.
That's the critical issue, isn't it? That's the critical issue, isn't it, gentlemen? It's almost as if they were saying, we're trying to show that this way that a particular drug is better than the drug we're using now, so we compared it to placebo, it seemed to work, therefore it's better than the drug we're using now, without actually looking at the drug that we're using now. So there was no classical strength training protocol in this study. What you have just described sounds nothing like what I or you and anybody else in this room uses to get clients stronger. And yet they and the mainstream media seem to be perfectly comfortable using this paper to justify a condemnation of the classical strength training approach.
The fact that they repeatedly tested 1RM throughout the study was a huge flaw in the methodology, because if you really wanted to look at the difference between how high repetition intervention compares to a lower repetition intervention, test 1RM in the beginning and then test it at the end, instead of letting them continually practice their 1RM, in addition to the fact that while they're testing their 1RM, they're being exposed to heavier loads.
They seem to think it was the strength of the study. I see it as a huge confounder.
I think it's a huge flaw. What these guys did was so far removed from what practitioners in the field actually do, and I think this study is a great example of these guys are good researchers, they're accomplished researchers in the field of muscle physiology, but probably people who do not have any significant practical experience. One of the other things that the authors acknowledge in their results is that they acknowledge the fact that if you actually want to improve your maximal force production capability in terms of 1RM outcomes, that you do periodically have to lift heavier weights. And that's something that kind of gets lost in the presentation of this study, is that you lift light weights, you get just as strong as heavy weights. Well, that's not even what the authors actually say in the paper. They say if you want to get strong, you have to periodically lift maximal heavy weights.
The frame of the problem. So the assays were excellent. The presentation of the data was pretty good. And if you look at the data straight, you can kind of actually pull some information from it, and it'll be it'll be a data point. The question is how we frame these results. I mean, the title of the paper itself frames the question in a way that is inappropriate. Is it resistance training? It's machine circuit training, if we're going to be precise. Is it high load resistance training? No, they're both lightweight. Regardless of how you do it, because they're doing 200-pound benches, their max, or 215. So the highest load lifted, when you're talking, is about 180, and when you're talking about the low weight group, you're talking 30 to 80%. You're talking about somebody lifting a bench press at 65 pounds for reps. So, and when we put it in that perspective, the frame changes a lot.
Because the New York Times and the rest of the mainstream media are always going to frame it's like the diet pill thing, right? So they're always going to frame the problem as science has now proven, right, that you can do a program that's easier because you're not lifting heavy weight, right? And the subtext of that is not only will it be easier, but the physicians will see that that's also safer. And the physical therapists will say that's also safer. That is how this information is being framed in the mainstream media right now. This is the takeaway that people who are giving this paper a very superficial reading or no reading at all, right, are framing these results. And that's what makes it an important paper. Its actual contribution to what we know about exercise physiology and what we know about training is, I think, negligible. I don't think that this paper actually tells us anything about programming or exercise physiology.
I think more than anything, like you just touched on, this paper, to me, highlights how large the gap is between what practitioners in the field actually do and the types of research that's being done related to resistance training.
As is so commonly the case, I think we have here a paper whose findings have been vastly overblown and breathlessly misrepresented in the mainstream media. The idea that you can get just as strong using light weights at very high reps as in a more traditional low rep high weight program is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of our panel, not supported by the data presented in this reasonably well done study, because the experimental model and samples used here cannot possibly support such a conclusion.